Hey guys! Tonight we will tell the story of Queen Mary II, whose destiny was determined by powerful men and dark political schemes. She was the favourite daughter of an infamous king, but her own faith turned her into the greatest threat to her father's throne. Let me know where you are watching from and what time it is locally for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Mary II was born on the 30th day of April, in the year 1662, within the walls of St. James's Palace, at a moment when England itself seemed to breathe in long, uneasy waves. Throughout her short life, Mary had to face an unending struggle. Her siblings became rivals. Her love for her husband was betrayed by a mistress right inside her home, and ultimately, she was forced to make the most horrifying choice: loyalty to her own blood or saving the religion of the nation. We will explore the heights and depths that shaped this Stuart queen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Her grandfather, King Charles I, had been executed, an event so shocking that even decades later it felt like a bruise on the English soul. Her father James and his brother, the future Charles II, had wandered in exile across foreign courts, living between hope and humiliation. Only when Charles II was invited back to England and crowned did the family's fortunes shift. Those two sisters, small hands once clasped together in the nursery, would grow to stand at the centre of so many political fractures and family sorrows that their names would later seem tied to the very tremors of the Stuart age. When Mary took her first breaths, the Stuart dynasty had only just been restored to the throne after years of civil war and uncertainty. With his return came a kind of fragile stability, and yet, even in that restoration, small cracks had already begun to show. The kingdom had been stitched back together, but the seams were thin. Mary's mother, Anne Hyde, had married her father under circumstances that many considered scandalous. She had become pregnant before marriage, and court society, always eager for gossip, turned the affair into a spectacle. But even that warmth held an expiration date, for religion so deeply woven into the politics of the time would become the blade that eventually severed the tender closeness between father and daughter. Under the orders of King Charles II, Mary was raised firmly within the Church of England. Her parents, however, drifted steadily toward Catholicism, a growing devotion that stirred anger and dread in the country. Her father, James, added another layer of unease by revealing early signs of devotion to Roman Catholicism, a faith that England regarded with deep suspicion. And yet, despite these shadows, Mary's earliest memories must have felt gentle. As a little girl, she was cherished by her father, showered with affection, lifted high in his arms as he proudly presented her to those around him. For a brief moment in her childhood, she lived in the warmth of uncomplicated love. And so Mary grew up caught between two currents: the political weight of her family's past and the religious tension of its present. She moved from palace to palace, St. James's, Hampton Court, Richmond, carried along by decisions far above the reach of her young understanding. Eventually, she was placed in the household of Lady Frances Villiers, who was entrusted with her education and well-being. Lady Villiers presided over a lively household filled with children, and among them was her own daughter, Elizabeth Villiers. At the time, Elizabeth was simply another girl sharing Mary's world, a familiar face in the nursery, a quiet companion at lessons, a shadow drifting through corridors lined with tapestries. Mary could not have foreseen that this girl, so unremarkable in childhood, would one day become the very source of a long, aching sorrow that would follow her into adulthood. Thus, Mary's early life unfolded gently on the surface. Prayers murmured in chapel rooms, soft footsteps in long galleries, the muted rustle of governesses' skirts at dusk. But beneath that surface, threads were already tightening around her future. Her lineage, her faith, her parents' choices, the expectations of a kingdom, everything was shaping her toward a life where she would be used as symbol, as bargaining piece, as sovereign, as sacrifice. Those quiet rooms of her childhood, filled with light and learning, were not the safe haven they appeared to be. They were the antechamber of a destiny marked by fracture. And though she did not yet know it, the tender years she spent under the gentle gaze of her father, beside her sister Anne, and in the company of Elizabeth Villiers, were only the faint beginning of a story that would slowly wear her down through family, through politics, and through the long, exhausting demands of a crown she never sought for herself. Mary grew up within the quiet chambers of Richmond Palace, where her days unfolded according to the gentle, polished expectations placed upon a royal daughter. She learned French in soft, murmuring syllables, repeating each phrase until it drifted smoothly from her tongue. She read poetry and plays, letting the cadence of words wash over her like slow-moving streams, and she stepped with delicate reverence through the rituals of the Anglican Church. Though she was not yet deeply devout in childhood, something in the rhythm of prayers, in the tender hush of chapels, began to settle like dust upon her spirit, waiting for the years that would deepen her faith. Around her, the palace breathed in long, careful sighs. Servants folded linens, tutors recited lessons, and governesses guided her through corridors lined with tapestries. It all seemed peaceful, but in the distance far enough for a child to overlook, yet close enough to cast a faint shadow, the country trembled beneath religious tension. Her father, James, was no longer subtle about his loyalty to Roman Catholicism. Each step he took toward that forbidden faith stirred more unease in Protestant England. Every rumour, every sermon, every whispered conversation revealed the same dread, that a Catholic king would one day sit upon the English throne. Mary, raised firmly as an Anglican by command of King Charles II, began to feel the slow widening space between herself and the man she loved most. That distance did not break loudly. It opened silently, like a seam splitting beneath embroidered fabric. Her girlhood, gentle as it appeared, held its small storms. She formed a tender friendship with Francis Apsley, a connection woven through girlish letters and secret names. Mary called herself Clarinda, and she named her friend Aurelia. They wrote to each other with the sweetness of children who believed the world to be soft and full of promise. But innocence often bends beneath the weight of new emotions. When her younger sister Anne grew close to Francis as well, jealousy slipped into Mary's heart. It startled her, this unfamiliar ache, sharp and uninvited. The small crack it created between the sisters never fully healed. With time, it would widen, fed by distance, influence, and fate. At 11 years old, Mary met Mary of Modena, the young bride of her father. Only 4 years older than she, the new duchess was gentle and displaced. A foreign girl carried across borders into a marriage she had not chosen. The two Marys found comfort in each other almost immediately, sharing quiet moments like two lanterns flickering in the same draught. The exclusion crisis rose like a storm over England. Parliament, driven by fear of Catholic rule, attempted to bar James from inheriting the throne. King Charles II resisted, determined to protect his brother's rights. And Mary, still a girl with soft hands and unread dreams, drifted unknowingly at the centre of forces large enough to shift the history of nations. Those days at Richmond felt quiet, almost golden, but their stillness was an illusion. Yet beneath their growing closeness lay a truth young Mary could not yet see. Mary of Modena embodied the fate that waited for her. A life shaped not by personal desire, but by the cold necessities of dynastic politics. One day, Mary herself would be sent away across sea, across language, across familiarity, and the tenderness of her childhood would vanish behind her like a dimming light. While she still moved through lessons and gardens, the kingdom stirred with far greater currents. The childhood she knew letters with Francis, jealousy toward Anne, the gentle presence of Mary of Modena, the soft cadence of prayers was not the story itself, but merely the prelude. The threads of her destiny were already tightening, and soon the world would call her away from innocence forever. Mary was 15 years old when the news arrived, slipping into her life like a cold wind that made every warm corner of childhood disappear. Beneath every peaceful morning lay the tremor of uncertainty. The kingdom argued over religion, court factions sharpened their ambitions. The threat of division pulsed beneath every decision her father made. And Mary, unaware of how deeply her life was already entangled with the fate of England, continued her days like a leaf floating above a river whose currents had already chosen her path. What seemed like calm was only the hushed breath before the future broke open. She arrived not into peace, but into a world still trembling from old storms. She was the daughter of James, the man who would one day become King James II, and her mother was Anne Hyde, a woman whose presence at court had always carried the faint echo of whispered controversy. Their household produced 8 children in total, yet only 2, the elder Mary and her younger sister Anne, would survive into adulthood. She was to be married to William of Orange, her cousin, yet a stranger, a man known for his distant manner, his frail health, and his history as an enemy of England. When her father told her, the words struck like a blow. Mary broke down in tears, unable to steady her breath. She was far too young to leave the familiar rooms of her homeland, far too innocent to understand the intricate threads of diplomacy and fear that had woven her fate for her. England had allied itself with the Dutch Republic in the long, grinding conflict against France, and Mary, soft-hearted, unprepared, barely stepping into womanhood, became a piece on the chessboard of nations. A child of the state, with no voice of her own. William, 12 years older than Mary, had a reputation that preceded him. He was reserved to the point of frost, serious beyond comfort, and weakened by lifelong struggles with asthma. The palaces held innovations she had never seen before: running water, marble baths, silk-covered furniture, an elegance achieved without ostentation. Streets were tidy, households meticulous. The people welcomed her not with suspicion but with warmth, waving flags and calling out blessings to the young Princess of Orange. The kindness of strangers felt like a soft blanket around her grief, and gradually, like a tide pulling backward, the darkness of her first days began to retreat. Against every expectation, affection grew, and then love. For a brief time, the two found themselves almost happy, as though their marriage forced upon them in youth had somehow transformed into a partnership shaped by genuine care. Mary visited gardens and learned Dutch customs. William allowed his guarded expression to relax in her presence. Their lives, bound by politics, had begun to form a gentle thread of companionship, and with time, she also began to see William differently. She noticed, almost reluctantly at first, the quiet humour that flickered through his stern demeanour when they were alone. She saw how deeply the Dutch adored him, how they looked at him with hope and trust. She saw his discipline, his steadiness, his unshakable commitment to duty. Slowly, something thawed between them. Their words grew warmer, their glances softer, and evenings spent together became moments Mary treasured. In time, however, Elizabeth would step into the most hidden part of Mary's life, the space reserved for a wife's trust, a wife's heart. Elizabeth Villiers became William's mistress. The revelation did not come all at once. It crept toward Mary in fragments, in whispers, in the subtle ways William's absence stretched late into the night. When the truth settled fully within her, it pressed like a cold weight against her ribs. But the fragile warmth of their marriage held a shadow Mary could not yet see clearly. Moving quietly through the corridors of her household was a familiar figure from her childhood. Elizabeth Villiers, the daughter of Lady Frances Villiers, who had helped raise Mary at Richmond. Elizabeth had travelled with her to The Hague as part of her attendance, her presence unremarkable at first, merely another part of Mary's past carried into the present. Elizabeth, once a girl who shared her childhood walls, now stood as the quiet fracture within her marriage. From that moment onward, Mary's heart would never again remain whole. And though she continued to walk with grace, to speak with gentleness, and to love William with steadfast loyalty, the first true sorrow of her adult life had already carved its place within her, deep and unyielding. In the Netherlands, Mary lived within a quiet world, shaped by order and gentle discipline. Her days unfolded softly, as though each hour were placed carefully beside the next. She embroidered with patient hands, read books beneath windows washed in pale northern light, walked slowly through gardens where the air carried the scent of damp earth, and attended church with the steady devotion expected of a princess. And every evening, she waited always with the same faint hope for William to return home. Her tenderness, her calm manner, her willingness to adapt to a land not her own made her beloved among the Dutch people. They called her the flower of their country, and Mary, shy and modest, accepted their affection with gratitude that never quite erased the ache within her. For although her life had a certain quiet grace, the one joy she longed for most, a child, did not come. In the year 1678, Mary became pregnant for the first time. Her heart, still tender from the upheavals of recent years, bloomed with hope. But the hope was short-lived. She miscarried, and the loss left her weak, exhausted, and wrapped in a sorrow she tried hard to hide. She recovered slowly, breathing through the sadness in long, steadying breaths, telling herself there would be another chance. There was. Later that same year, she conceived once more. The quiet pain lingered behind her gentle smile, a shadow she would carry across the years. While Mary endured the weight of her private sorrows, another sorrow waited, one that would cut even deeper because of its familiarity. William, despite his respect for her and despite the affection that had grown between them, began an affair with Elizabeth Villiers, the same Elizabeth who had lived beside Mary in childhood, who had walked the halls of Richmond Palace with her. Again her heart lifted. Again she dared to imagine a child in her arms, a small life that might soften the world around her. But the second pregnancy ended as the first had, in another miscarriage. The grief settled heavier this time, as though it had discovered a place inside her and intended to remain, and that second loss would be her last chance. Mary was only 16 years old, and already the dream of becoming a mother had closed around her like a dim, unreachable horizon. Elizabeth, so woven into Mary's early life, became the secret companion of her husband, and the betrayal struck with a coldness Mary had never imagined. William did not stop loving his wife, but he hid the truth from her, pushing the affair into shadowed corners where he hoped it would remain unseen. Yet secrets have a way of breathing, of shifting quietly until they come into full view. Mary first understood the truth during a severe illness, a sickness so deep that some believed she might die. In those days of weakness, when her defenses were lowered and her thoughts drifted in fragile patterns, the whispers and signs around her grew impossible to ignore. The presence of Elizabeth lingered too close, too often. The late-night absences of William, the quiet tension in the household, they formed a pattern she could no longer look away from. When the realization settled fully within her, she did not cry out, did not confront William with rage, did not allow jealousy to twist her into sharp words. Mary, who had been raised to value duty above desire, chose silence. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of a heart that knew too well the cost of speaking. She hid her hurt beneath a composure that astonished even those closest to her. She did so for her husband, whom she still loved, for the fragile stability of their political position, and for herself, for the part of her that would rather endure in quiet agony than expose the vulnerability she kept hidden from the world. Yet beneath her calm exterior, something shifted. Mary stepped onto a darker path, one where religion, family pressure, political storms, and the sting of personal betrayal intertwined until they were impossible to separate. The safe places of her youth were gone. In their place stretched a future shaped by burdens she would carry without complaint, even as they pressed gently, steadily, against the softest parts of her soul. In the year 1685, after long years marked by religious tension and the quiet dread that seemed to settle over England like a low fog, King Charles II died. His passing shifted the entire order of the kingdom. Mary's father ascended the throne as King James II, and with that single moment, the delicate balance of hope and fear across the realm tipped sharply. Because James had no legitimate sons, Mary stood as the heir presumptive next in line, yet always vulnerable to displacement should a male heir be born. The title carried weight, but also an ever-present uncertainty, as though her future rested on a thread that might snap at any time. To the people of Protestant England, Mary became a symbol of fragile hope. They knew her as the daughter raised in the Anglican faith, the one light in a lineage that was growing darker with the force of Catholic fervour. For James was more than quietly devoted. He was unbending, determined, and intent on restoring Roman Catholicism to a nation that had fought bitterly to cast it away. The thought of a Catholic monarch, especially one with such zeal, sent tremors through Parliament and households alike. Sermons rose in uneasy tones. Gossip turned fearful. The country, once merely uneasy, seemed now to pulse with a deep instability. Mary, far away in the Netherlands, felt these tremors in letters, in reports, in the changing tone of the world around her. She loved her father. She had once been his cherished child, carried proudly in his arms. The journey across the Channel was battered by storms, fierce winds, and grey waves that seemed to echo her despair. She wept not only for fear of the unknown, but for the simple, heartbreaking truth that she had not been allowed to choose her own life. Yet when she finally reached the Netherlands, the world shifted beneath her. The land she had feared, imagined as cold, harsh, and unwelcoming, was instead astonishingly clean, orderly, and full of hidden beauty. People often described him as distant, almost unreachable. Even during their wedding ceremony on the 4th day of November in the year 1677, Mary cried quietly at first, then helplessly as vows were spoken, and her life was bound to a man she barely knew. Her tears did not stop with the ceremony. They followed her onto the ship that carried her away from England, onto deck where the wind roared and the sea pitched beneath her feet. And yet, she could not betray the faith in which she had been raised, the faith that had shaped her conscience since childhood. Caught between love and conviction, she stood quietly in the middle of two powerful opposing currents, knowing that whichever way she turned, someone would accuse her of betrayal. James pressed her relentlessly. His letters, once affectionate, grew stern, demanding, and heavy with reproach. Her resolve, quiet but unwavering, stood in sharp contrast to her father's fervour. But Mary's challenges did not end with matters of state or religion. Across the sea, her heart bore wounds that deepened with each passing season. Her marriage, once tender and hopeful, grew shadowed by the presence of Elizabeth Villiers. What had begun quietly whispers in corners, brief absences, glimpses of unease had by now become an ache Mary could not escape. Elizabeth had been part of her childhood world, a familiar figure from Richmond Palace. That familiarity only made the betrayal more piercing. It felt as though pieces of her past were rising up to wound her in the present. William, for all his strengths and stern virtues, did not know how to speak the soft words Mary needed. He did not admit the affair. He did not offer reassurance. He simply continued forward, divided between duty, politics, and his own guarded heart. And so Mary carried her grief alone. She buried it beneath the calm demeanour that so many admired in her. She tended to her responsibilities, wrote letters in her steady hand, prayed in the quiet of her rooms, and kept her sorrow folded neatly between the lines of her days. The Netherlands remained orderly around her. Gardens bloomed. The air swept in from the canals with familiar chill. The Dutch people continued to adore her, calling her their flower. Yet inside, Mary felt her petals slowly bruising under the weight of pressures she could not share. The expectations of a nation, the spiritual disappointment of a father, the heartbreak of a husband's disloyalty, all wove together into a sorrow she carried with grace, but not without cost. She never shouted. She never blamed. She never surrendered to despair in public. England had seen religious conflict before, but this time the threat felt sharper, closer, and carried by the very man who held the crown. Into this growing turmoil stepped a figure whose very existence symbolized unrest. James, Duke of Monmouth, the illegitimate son of Charles II and cousin to Mary. Monmouth was Protestant, charismatic, and deeply beloved by many who longed for a future free from Catholic rule. While Mary lived quietly in the Netherlands beside William, the storm surrounding her father in England grew darker with every passing month. King James II no longer bothered to conceal his intentions. His devotion to Roman Catholicism deepened into open determination, and his decisions stirred unease across the kingdom. The nobility whispered in fear, the common people murmured anxiously, and the Parliament watched him with increasing suspicion. When Parliament failed in earlier attempts to exclude James II from the succession, the discontent that had simmered beneath the surface swelled into open rebellion. Those who wished to see a Protestant king gathered around Monmouth, and in the year 1685, he launched what would be known as the Monmouth Rebellion. He sailed from the Netherlands back to England, landing with the hope and the desperate belief that he could overthrow Mary's father. William and Mary had once welcomed him in The Hague, offering hospitality to a man who was, in many ways, a political threat to James. But as the tensions between nations and families hardened, William and Mary were forced to distance themselves from him. Politics offered no room for warmth. The rebellion failed swiftly and brutally. Monmouth, once so adored, was captured and sentenced to death. His execution was cruel and clumsy, a moment that left England shuddering at the sight of a man once considered a possible king, dying with terror in his eyes. The message was unmistakable. James II would tolerate no defiance, and he would crush opposition without hesitation. But the rebellion exposed something James could not ignore: the alarming weakness of the English militia. Shaken by this vulnerability, he resolved never to rely on such an unsteady force again. He created a standing army, a professional force loyal directly to him, and began filling its officer ranks with Catholics. The move frightened the English elite. A Catholic king with a Catholic army at his command seemed far too close to the model of absolute monarchy practiced in France. Whispers of tyrant and absolutist began to thread through London's drawing rooms and taverns alike. The worry spread like a low, persistent rumble, growing louder beneath every decision James made. Meanwhile, Mary remained in the Netherlands, trapped in a strange duality. To the Dutch, she was the gentle Princess of Orange. To the English Protestants, she was the fragile hope for the future. But to James II, she was the daughter who stood too close to the world he mistrusted. A daughter whose loyalty he doubted, whose faith he disapproved of. She lived caught between the love of a father and the suspicion of a king, between her identity as a Stuart and her obligations as the wife of the Dutch stadtholder. And as the storms of politics closed in on her family, the storms at home seeped deeper into her marriage. William continued his secret relationship with Elizabeth Villiers, a wound that never fully healed within Mary. She felt the distance sharpening between them, an invisible wall that grew higher each time William slipped away into the night. There was one night she never forgot, a night when she waited at the bottom of a dim staircase until the bells struck 2 in the morning. She watched the shadows shift on the landing, and then she saw him, William, moving quietly toward Elizabeth's chamber. Mary said nothing. She made no scene, no outburst, no accusation. She simply stood still in the cool darkness, letting the truth settle into her chest like a stone sinking through water. She kept her silence out of duty, out of fear, out of love, and out of the loneliness that wrapped itself around her more tightly each year. On the political stage, the winds were howling. In her marriage, the winds howled too, a quieter, more intimate kind of storm. And Mary, still so young and yet so burdened, felt both storms pressing against her heart at once, pulling her gently, relentlessly, toward a future that would demand more of her than she had ever imagined. Gilbert Burnet entered Mary's world at the very moment her life seemed stretched between faith, marriage, and an increasingly unstable kingdom. He was a Scottish clergyman, a historian, and a thinker sharp-minded, yet warm in manner. William discovered that Burnet was useful not only for his political insight, but also for the clarity with which he understood the delicate balance of power between England and the broader European world. Before long, Burnet became a trusted advisor to both William and Mary, guiding them with calm conviction through the political storms gathering on every horizon. Mary, meanwhile, held a simple assumption in her heart. James II despised him, accused him of treason, forced him from England, and drove him into exile. And so Burnet crossed the sea to the Netherlands, seeking refuge under William's protection. At first, many believed William, so reserved, so guarded, would keep the outspoken Scotsman at arm's length. But slowly, the opposite happened. If someday her father were deposed, or if he died, and she became Queen of England, she believed that William, her husband, would naturally assume the role of ruler. She imagined herself stepping back, as she had in the Netherlands, allowing him to carry the burdens of governance while she lent quiet support. It seemed obvious to her, almost predetermined, but Burnet saw the danger in that thinking. And so, gently but firmly, he corrected her. In England, he explained, the crown followed blood. If Mary ascended the throne by right of birth, then the authority belonged to her alone. A husband of a reigning queen held no automatic power. Unless Parliament granted it, and unless Mary herself agreed William would not rule, Burnet's words reached her with the slow force of an approaching tide. Mary was startled, then uneasy, then deeply thoughtful. She had not been trained for command. She had not been raised with an ambition for power. He urged her to abandon Anglicanism and convert to Catholicism, calling her duty, her salvation, her obedience into question. And though his words were sharp, sometimes even threatening, Mary responded with the same calm, respectful tone she had carried since girlhood. She did not lash out, nor plead, nor argue with bitterness. She simply held her ground, speaking gently but firmly of her devotion to the Church of England. The thought of holding a crown, truly holding it, not merely wearing it, filled her with a heaviness she had no name for. After many quiet days of reflection, Mary reached a decision. If she became queen, she would choose to let William govern, trusting his judgment and steadiness more than her own. But she added one request, gentle in tone, yet rooted in her deepest wound. If William were to rule through her right, he must obey the command found in Scripture: "Husbands, love your wives." Beneath that simple sentence lay the shadow of Elizabeth Villiers, the mistress whose very presence had carved a hollow in Mary's heart. Burnet understood. William, when told, understood even more. But understanding did not erase the ache that had already taken root. While Mary struggled privately with her faith, her marriage, and the unsettling possibility of wearing a crown she did not want, events in England spun dangerously out of control. Instead, she moved through each day with soft composure, holding within her a quiet ache that deepened as her life grew more intertwined with forces she could neither control nor refuse. And though the world saw her as serene, the gentle princess turned future queen, Mary herself felt the faint beginning of storms. She would soon have no choice but to weather storms born of faith, of family, of power, and of the fragile human heart. Their trial became a turning point. When they were found not guilty, the people erupted in relief and triumph. The verdict sent a message louder than any rebellion. England had reached its limit. James had crossed the final line. From behind the scenes, a covert alliance quietly formed. 7 influential nobles, later called the Immortal Seven, began writing to William in the Netherlands. Their letters were cautious but clear, pleading but strategic. They told him England needed rescue, that Protestantism needed protection, that Mary's rightful future was being stolen. And then, at last, they extended the invitation that would change the course of British history. They asked William to invade England, to save the Church, to save the kingdom, and, without saying it directly, to save Mary's place in the world. And in the quiet chambers of The Hague, Mary waited, caught between the father she still loved, the husband she still trusted, and a destiny she had never asked for but could no longer escape. William's acceptance of the invitation was the moment James II had feared above all others. The Immortal Seven had called for him to save England, and William, measured, deliberate, and never one to act on impulse, agreed. His reasons were many. He wished to defend the Protestant faith, yes, but he also feared that James might unite with Louis XIV of France, forming a Catholic alliance powerful enough to threaten the Dutch Republic. For William, the decision was political, strategic, and necessary. But for Mary, it opened a wound far deeper than politics. She was the daughter of the king who would soon be overthrown, and she was the wife of the man leading the fleet that would dethrone him. James began to write to her letters full of reproach, sorrow, warning, and accusation. He begged her to reject William's cause, to return to him, to renounce the Protestant faith that separated them. Mary answered with the same calm voice she had always used with her father, respectful, steady, but unmovable. She could not abandon her church. She could not betray her husband. She could not follow James into the darkness his rule had created. Every letter she wrote must have torn at her heart, yet she never allowed her pain to spill beyond the ink on the page. William prepared for the invasion with his usual icy discipline. He calculated, planned, and organized with almost mechanical precision. Yet beneath that hard exterior, something gentler stirred. Before he departed, he and Mary met for a final farewell, one unlike anything she had ever seen from him. Mary waited. She prayed. She walked through dim rooms with hands clasped, listening for footsteps that would not return yet. She read every letter with trembling hope. She feared both for her husband's life and for her father's soul. And then the flood of news began. William landed in England in the year 1688. The moment his boots touched British soil, the foundation beneath James's reign began to fracture. Powerful nobles defected. Officers abandoned him. William, the man who rarely showed emotion, who hid his heart beneath duty and distance, broke down. He told her that if he died in England she should remarry, that she should not spend her life in loneliness. His voice faltered. His composure threatened to collapse. And Mary, whose heart had so often been bruised by his coldness and by the shadow of Elizabeth Villiers, wept with him. Then he left her behind in the Netherlands, surrounded by silences that grew heavier with each passing day. And with the king gone, England faced a question vast enough to reshape the entire monarchy. Who now would rule, and under what form? At Westminster, the debates began. Voices clashed like storm winds in Parliament. Some insisted James be considered still king, and that William and Mary should act as regents. Others wished for William alone. Others wanted Mary alone. The kingdom divided itself into countless visions of the future, each one reflecting fear, hope, or ambition. Even members of his own family slipped away. The kingdom shifted like a tide pulling itself from the shore, leaving James standing alone. Rather than fight, James fled. He attempted once to escape, was captured, and then fled again, this time successfully seeking refuge in France under Louis XIV's protection. The throne stood empty, and for the first time in English history, two monarchs would reign jointly by parliamentary design. William and Mary would rule together as William III and Mary II. To many observers, it appeared a triumph. A daughter rising to the throne, a husband and wife crowned side by side, a Protestant renewal beginning. But to Mary, it felt nothing like triumph. It felt like a burden wrapped in gold. She had taken the crown while her father lived in exile, but one voice was unwavering, William's. He would not accept a role as the husband of a queen without power. He would not stand beside the throne while someone else ruled. Mary, remembering all Burnet had taught her, knowing her own lack of political training, agreed. She did not wish to govern alone. She did not want the weight of the crown pressing solely onto her shoulders. And so, a compromise was born. James, having fled, was declared to have abdicated. The throne was vacant. She had become queen by an act of parliament that branded her father a fugitive. She felt the weight of scripture, of conscience, of the unseen judgment of God. She felt the sting of history watching her, and she felt the emptiness inside her marriage, the fractures that had never fully healed, widening again beneath the glitter of coronation robes. The world saw victory. Mary felt only sorrow, quiet, dignified, and heavy as the crown she never wished to wear. When the crown was finally placed within reach, Mary faced one more test, one not written in laws or treaties, but etched into the eyes of the people who awaited her. Her return to England would determine whether she and William were truly accepted as rightful sovereigns. And William, ever aware of public sentiment, wrote to her with unmistakable clarity. When she stepped onto English soil, she must appear calm, radiant, confident. She must smile. It repeated itself in her thoughts, soft but relentless, like water against a stone. She knew what she must do for England, and yet she also knew what the commandment required of her heart. Between these two truths, she felt as though something inside her were being quietly torn. When she arrived in England in the month of February of the year 1689, Mary hid every trace of turmoil behind a graceful, glowing composure. She must look as though every event, the flight of her father, the collapse of his reign, the rise of her own, had unfolded exactly as she wished. Any sign of sorrow, any shadow of grief, could unravel the fragile support they needed. If she looked mournful, the whispers would begin at once. She still loves her father more than her duty, and that doubt would weaken both throne and kingdom. But within Mary, the weight of scripture pressed heavily. Honor thy father and thy mother. Should a daughter smile so brightly while stepping into the very chambers her father had abandoned? Should she look so pleased while he lived in exile across the sea? Mary heard these murmurs. She recognized the sting in them. And beneath her composed exterior, she carried the guilt like a stone in her hands, heavy, cold, and impossible to set down. She told herself she was protecting the kingdom, its faith, and its future. She stepped onto the shore, smiling, serene and poised. Her presence eased the anxieties of many who had been unsettled by William's stern, distant demeanor. To them, Mary appeared warm, approachable, almost comforting, a gentle queen they believed they could trust. Cheers rose through the streets, and her name echoed with affection. But not everyone was reassured. Some watched her with narrowed eyes, whispering doubts that drifted through the corridors of London like cold drafts. She reminded herself that James had pushed the nation to a breaking point, had ignored counsel, had driven England toward absolutism. Yet none of these truths eased the ache of knowing she now slept in the rooms her father once called his own. No comfort softened the realization that the crown she wore had come into her hands only because the man who gave her life had lost his own kingdom. Mary stepped into queenship not with triumph, but with loneliness. In the summer of the year 1688, James's second wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward, a Catholic male heir. The very thing England had feared. In a single instant, Mary's position as heir presumptive vanished. A long Catholic dynasty now loomed before the kingdom, stretching into a future many believed England could not survive. At the same time, James arrested 7 Anglican bishops for refusing to proclaim his religious edicts. King James II began pushing past every boundary meant to restrain him. He forced Catholic influence into universities. He attempted to dismantle the Test Act's laws that prevented Catholics from holding high office. He used royal power like a blade, cutting through obstacles with increasing force. Each decision chipped away at the fragile trust of his people. Then came the moment that shook the entire nation. At the very moment she should have been surrounded by reassurance, her world grew quieter, emptier. William, absorbed entirely by war, politics, and the unending demands of continental conflict, was rarely at her side. He governed with intensity, travelling often, leaving Mary to rule in his absence and navigate a court filled with rivals and watchers. Her younger sister Anne, once a source of comfort, drifted further away under the sharp influence of Sarah Churchill. Their smiles gleamed carefully, their words moved like silk over sharpened steel. Almost none of them offered sincerity. They watched her for weakness, for hesitation, for any sign that might shift the precarious balance of favour and influence. And so the throne, coveted by so many, won through upheaval, defended through storms, felt to Mary like a cold chair placed in the centre of a draught-filled chamber. England was already in the grip of a vast conflict. In the year 1688, the 9 Years' War erupted, an immense struggle pitting William's European coalition against the powerful Kingdom of France under Louis XIV. And as the cannons thundered across the continent, another threat rose closer to Mary's heart. Her father, James II, far from accepting defeat, sailed to Ireland, a place where every whisper echoed, where every alliance carried hidden motives, where she must sit perfectly still, wearing grace like armour, and hold together a world that threatened constantly to unravel beneath her feet. She had become queen, but in that rise, she had stepped into a solitude deeper than any she had ever known. From the moment she and William ascended the throne, Mary barely had time to breathe before the world demanded more of her. Before departing, Parliament passed a special act, granting Mary the authority to govern fully in his absence. This meant she would not merely act as a ceremonial figure, she would rule. Decisions of war, defence, finance, diplomacy, and internal security would rest on her shoulders. For Mary, who had once confessed to Burnet that she was not made for politics, the weight was enormous. While William marched toward the Boyne, Mary faced a different terror. With the support of French forces and Irish Catholics, he meant to reclaim the throne he believed God had granted him. Ireland became his stronghold, the place from which he hoped to reverse the glorious revolution. This forced William to leave England in person. He could not remain safely in London while his rival gathered armies across the sea, and so he prepared to cross into Ireland, to face James in what would become the Battle of the Boyne. She ordered Admiral Arthur Herbert, Earl of Torrington, to take the fleet out and confront the French. Torrington hesitated. He believed the English navy was too weak to challenge the French at sea. He doubted victory. He doubted the weather. He doubted the strategy. But Mary's order was clear, and under pressure from both Crown and Government, he sailed out with half-hearted resolve. What followed was the disastrous Battle of Beachy Head. Reports reached London that the French fleet was moving toward the English Channel. Their ships, sleek, powerful, commanded by seasoned officers, advanced steadily, threatening to strike directly at England's vulnerable coast. If France landed troops, everything the glorious revolution had achieved could vanish in a matter of days. Mary summoned the Privy Council. She listened to ministers argue, weighed their fears, and then quietly, firmly made her decision. She absorbed the reports with a stillness that surprised even her council. She remained composed, issued commands, strengthened coastal defences, and kept the government steady. And then, unexpectedly, a stroke of fortune came. Instead of launching an invasion, the French fleet raided a few coastal towns, burned ships, and withdrew. The local population, ordinary villagers, even some who still supported James, rose up together and fought off the raiders with surprising ferocity. The English fleet faltered. The Dutch allies fought bravely but were left unsupported. and Torrington's uncertain command collapsed under the weight of French firepower. Ships burned, masts toppled, men were lost to the waves. When the battle ended, the English coast lay exposed. The news struck London like a chill wind. Whispers turned to panic. The French could land at any moment. Without William, without a fleet, without certainty, Mary could have given in to fear. But she did not. But the warmth faded quickly. The cycle resumed. William returned to war, driven by duty and his unyielding will to oppose France. Mary remained behind, surrounded by the rituals of governance and the long silences of empty royal chambers. Each departure stretched weeks into months. Each month deepened the quiet ache within her. She filled her days with prayer, with the study of scripture, with a sense of discipline that steadied her but never comforted her. Mary watched all this unfold with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The kingdom had survived its first great test of her regency. When William returned from Ireland, victorious after the Battle of the Boyne, he praised Mary openly. He told ministers, generals, and foreign envoys that she had ruled with wisdom, calm, and decisiveness. It warmed her heart more than she would ever admit. For a brief moment, she felt seen not only as a queen, but as a partner worthy of William's respect. But beneath the crown, she was a woman who walked through rooms too large for one heart, who carried a marriage full of cracks, and who smiled for a nation even when her own strength felt like a candle flickering in a storm. When William repeatedly crossed the Channel to lead campaigns in Europe, Mary remained in England alone, burdened with worries that arrived like slow-moving shadows and political dangers that grew sharper every month. At night she suffered headaches that throbbed behind her eyes, long bouts of sleeplessness, and the slow erosion of spirit that comes from bearing enormous responsibility alone. Mary was Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland. She was the symbol of the Protestant cause. She was praised in sermons and spoken of by diplomats with admiration. She whispered grievances into Anne's ear, magnified her insecurities, and encouraged every suspicion she held against her sister. Mary tried again and again to reach Anne, writing letters, attempting gentle conversations, offering reconciliatory gestures, but Anne turned away. She trusted Sarah absolutely and dismissed every warning Mary offered. And so, what should have been Mary's closest familial comfort slowly hardened into a cold distance that left her more isolated than ever. Among all the pressures she carried, the most exhausting was her worsening relationship with her younger sister, Anne. The emotional bond that had once linked the two daughters of James II was now strained to the point of breaking. Anne had fallen deeply under the influence of Sarah Churchill, a woman admired for her intelligence and wit, but also feared for her ambition, her pride, and her fierce hostility toward William and Mary. Sarah shaped Anne's beliefs, her moods, her loyalties. That possibility lingered over every council meeting Mary presided over like a silent, watching presence. Even as headaches throbbed behind her temples, even as sleepless nights blurred one into another, Mary maintained her calm. She strengthened garrisons. She signed orders to fortify the coast. She watched the movements of every official with suspected Jacobite leanings. The pressure weighed heavily, but she bore it with steady hands. Outside the palace walls, England stood in a state of constant tension. Reports from the continent arrived daily. The French, under Louis XIV, were preparing their fleets. Their ships gathered like storm clouds along the coasts. Rumours spread quickly, carried from taverns to marketplaces to the highest levels of government. James II might return at any moment, accompanied by French troops determined to reclaim the crown. John Churchill, a man who had once served the Stuarts and later supported William, now fell under suspicion of double loyalties. Mary had him detained not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. She could trust almost no one. When the French prepared their forces for a potential landing, Mary reacted with focus rather than fear. Instead of hiding the threat from the public, she chose transparency. She published James II's declaration, his attempt to justify an invasion, and placed beside it a strong rebuttal, exposing his intentions and highlighting the danger his return would bring to England. The message spread quickly. It steadied public opinion. It reminded the people that Mary, though gentle in manner, possessed a resolute mind. Then came the victories. British and Allied ships clashed with the French along the coasts, and the news of triumph drifted inland like a breath of relief. Villages cheered. Pamphlets praised her judgment. Songs were written calling her the woman who steered the nation through tempests. For many, Mary became the reassuring symbol. England needed a queen who did not tremble under pressure, who stood calm while danger gathered around her. Sarah, brilliant, ambitious, and unafraid of confrontation, held Anne in a grip of friendship that soon bent into control. And Sarah made no effort to hide her disdain for William or her suspicion toward Mary. Through Anne's distance, Mary lost not just a sister, but the last fragment of uncomplicated affection she could have had at court. Those who surrounded Mary in the palace hallways were polite, polished, and calculating, and James II, the father whose memory she could neither embrace nor reject, haunted her conscience. She carried guilt for the crown she wore, even though she had never sought it. She carried doubt about whether she had been a good daughter. She carried fear that she had failed as a wife. But while the nation admired her more each day, inside Mary's heart, the sense of emptiness deepened. The praise did not warm her marriage. William remained distant, lost in war, submerged in strategies, offering her only fragments of affection. Elizabeth Villiers still lingered like a shadow in their household, an ever-present reminder of betrayal. Anne, once her companion in childhood, was now a stranger guided by Sarah Churchill's ambitions. They read scripture in the dim glow of candlelight. They shared soft conversations, moments in which William allowed his guard to lower just enough for Mary to see the tenderness she still longed for. In those fragile intervals, she believed their love had never fully vanished, only been covered by the dust of war, distance, and unending duty. But spring always arrived, and with it, William's departure. Some nights, when the palace halls fell silent and only the cold lamps flickered, she sat alone with folded hands, wondering whether her life, fractured between faith, duty, and heartbreak, was truly her own. Each evening she descended into the same soft question, one without answers. Had she chosen this path, or had she simply been carried along by forces too vast to resist? She was a queen. She was a wife. She was a daughter living with the echo of exile. Each time Mary watched him leave, she felt her heart descend back into the familiar valley of fear and solitude. With every campaign he led, she feared the worst. That he might fall in battle, that France might strike while he was gone, that Jacobite sympathizers in the court might rise against her. Even the whispers of the people weighed on her mind, whispers accusing her of having stolen her father's crown, of being the cause of James II's exile. And she was a woman who, in the depths of her solitude, longed for a moment of warmth that politics, religion, and destiny seemed forever determined to deny her. Year after year, the same harsh rhythm returned, as predictable as the turning of the seasons yet heavy as winter fog. In the cold months, William came home, tired, burdened, but alive. And for a brief stretch of time, warmth returned to Mary's world. They walked together through quiet gardens, where frost clung to bare branches. When she appeared before ministers or ambassadors, she wore the same soft smile, the same serene expression, the same slow, gentle voice that reassured everyone around her. Because she seemed unshaken, many assumed she felt nothing. They mistook composure for coldness, stillness for indifference. They did not see the fear pressing inward, slowly reshaping her from within. As though her burdens were not already immense, her relationship with Anne now fractured beyond repair. Sarah Churchill's influence over Anne had grown stronger with each passing year, feeding her doubts, insecurities, and resentments. Sarah whispered that Mary disrespected her, that Mary did not value her, that Mary's loyalty was always divided between crown and husband, leaving no room for sisterhood. Anne believed it, completely. To know that William had turned to her felt like a wound carved into the oldest part of Mary's life. Whenever Elizabeth was summoned by William, whether for conversation, service, or counsel, Mary felt the fragile confidence she had built during their winter months together slipping away. She realized, with the kind of pain that deepened slowly, that her marriage had two forms, one that filled her with warmth when William was near, and another that crumbled the moment he was gone. And while Mary worked tirelessly to protect the kingdom, another ache remained lodged deep in her heart. Elizabeth Villiers. She still moved through the palace, still stood near William, still held a place in his private circles. Her presence was a quiet thorn Mary could never pull free. It was not only the betrayal that hurt it was the identity of the betrayer. Elizabeth had once been part of Mary's childhood, sharing tutors, rooms, and memories. Conversations between the sisters grew strained, sharp, or painfully shallow. Letters went unanswered. Visits became formal, distant, stripped of any warmth they once shared. Eventually, Mary had to accept the truth she had never wanted to face. The one person who might have understood her, the sister who shared her childhood, her memories, her blood was now the farthest from her. By the late 1690s, Mary had become a paradox in the eyes of her kingdom, a queen admired for firmness in war, yet fragile in the quiet spaces of her private life. To the world, she appeared steady, dutiful, almost luminous in her composure. But behind closed doors, she lived a life steeped in silence, prayer, and the soft ache of responsibilities that had never once allowed her to choose for herself. Much of her time was spent in devotion. As William waged war abroad, Mary waged wars of her own wars, of conscience, of family ties unraveling, of loneliness heavy enough to silence her breath. She carried her crown with grace. But every night, as she lay awake, listening to the echoing quiet of the palace, she felt more and more like a solitary figure caught between the demands of a kingdom and the unspoken griefs of her own heart. She issued proclamations encouraging sobriety, discouraging profanity and vice, promoting spiritual renewal across the realm. Not from a place of severity, but from gentleness, from her belief that England needed a moral healing just as urgently as it needed military strength. Yet, inside Mary, exhaustion deepened. She had never lived a single year for herself. Her childhood had been carved by politics, her marriage chosen for diplomacy, her crown placed upon her by Parliament. She prayed each morning and night, sometimes for hours, seeking a peace that politics could not offer. She wrote reflections in her journals with slow, careful strokes. She embroidered intricate patterns that calmed her breath. She read the scriptures until their familiar lines wrapped around her like a thin blanket of comfort. Her faith was the one sanctuary she could truly enter without fear, and so she shaped her reign around it. Even when present, he was never fully present, not in the way Mary longed for. There were moments when he forgot her efforts, her loneliness, the weight she bore in his absence. She did not resent him, but the neglect settled in her heart like winter frost. During these years, her physical strength began to wither. The headaches that once throbbed occasionally now struck with a force that blurred her vision. Vertigo crept in, making the palace corridors tilt beneath her steps. Her pregnancies ended in grief. Her husband's affections clouded by Elizabeth Villiers. Her sister's loyalty stolen by Sarah Churchill. And her father, once the man who lifted her onto his knee, now saw her as the instrument of his downfall. At every turn, Mary had been shaped for others, never for her own desires. Meanwhile, William remained absorbed in war. His mind lived in maps, troop movements, alliances, and dispatches. But at night, when Kensington Palace lay silent and the candles flickered their last breaths, Mary sometimes whispered into the darkness that she was tired terribly, unendurably tired. In the autumn of the year 1694, Mary continued her duties with the same serenity everyone expected of her. She attended council meetings, signed documents, read correspondence, encouraged the moral reforms she believed England needed. Her body felt heavy, as though wrapped in unseen chains. A cough began to linger in her chest, first soft, then deeper, then frequent enough that she pressed her handkerchief to her lips whenever she was alone. Still, she hid it all. She did not want William burdened by worry. She did not want the court to speak of a weak queen. She had carried a kingdom through invasion threats, political betrayal, and years of war. She refused to falter now. There was no sign from her outward appearance that her strength was failing. No hint that her body was approaching a breaking point. But fate had already begun its silent work. No one in her household suspected that this would be the last autumn Mary would ever see. That the crisp air settling over Kensington carried with it the first shadows of a tragedy none of them could halt. Not William, with all his armies. Not the physicians, with all their remedies. It started with a lingering ache in her limbs, then a fever, then a strange, burning discomfort beneath her skin. When the first red spots appeared on her arm, small, angry, unmistakable Mary felt her heart sink like a stone dropped into deep water. She knew what it was. Smallpox. The disease that had taken so many in her family. The disease that had scarred, crippled or killed countless across England. not Mary herself, with all her prayers and her quiet resilience. The path before her, long shaped by duty and sorrow, was nearing its final turn, one that would soon reveal how fragile even a queen's life could be, and how deeply a nation could grieve the woman who had held it together through years of storm. In December of the year 1694, Mary's strength finally began to slip in a way no willpower could disguise. These murmurs wounded her more deeply than she ever admitted. Mary's body began to suffer under the weight of her responsibilities. Persistent headaches shadowed her days. Pressure tightened across her chest like an invisible hand. Sleep slipped away from her, leaving her with long hours of silence in vast, lonely rooms. At times, waves of panic rose through her quiet, restrained, concealed carefully beneath her calm demeanor. No one at court knew the true extent of her struggles. In it, she spoke of the wound that had never fully healed, the presence of Elizabeth Villiers. She wrote of the sorrow she had carried for years, the hurt she had never expressed, the fear that William's heart might drift so far into infidelity that he would lose the better part of himself. She wrote not with accusation, but with gentleness, a last attempt to lay bare the truth between them. Mary understood its signs more clearly than any physician, and she knew the most terrifying truth. If the rash vanished too quickly from the skin, it meant the sickness had turned inward, drowning the organs in inflammation and shutting the body down. That disappearance, silent and swift, was often the step before death. In the earliest days of her illness, Mary remained astonishingly composed. When news reached William that Mary had contracted smallpox, he rushed back to her side without hesitation. The man known for iron restraint, for a lifetime of self-containment, broke open completely. He stayed beside her day and night, refusing to sleep, refusing to leave even for meals. He held her hand constantly, as if his grip alone could anchor her to life. Courtiers whispered in alarm when they saw him pale, trembling, eyes swollen from tears. Many feared he would collapse under the weight of grief before Mary even passed. And still Mary declined, her memory blurred at the edges. Words slipped away before she could form them. At times, she drifted into panic, crying out that Catholic nurses were standing at the foot of her bed, phantoms born from childhood terror, from the religious anxieties that had shaped her entire life. Then, moments later, she would regain clarity, whispering prayers with calm resignation. By the time the rash began to fade, the dreadful sign, she had feared the physicians knew there was nothing to be done. William sat beside her, holding her hand as the fever carried her further from the world. He whispered to her, pleaded with her, tried to catch her fading gaze. But Mary slipped in and out of awareness, already half beyond reach. In the midst of this darkness came a fragile ray of reconciliation. Anne, the sister Mary had loved and lost to ambition and manipulation, sent word begging to make peace before it was too late. When the message reached Mary, she was barely conscious, yet she summoned the strength to nod in gratitude. It was her last clear gesture, her final act of forgiveness. From that point forward, her body surrendered quickly. The Queen, who had held a kingdom steady through storms, who had borne betrayal with grace, who had carried duty like a shield and faith like a lantern, left the world quietly, leaving behind a husband undone, a sister in tears, and a nation already beginning to understand the depth of the loss it had suffered. The death of Mary cast a long, heavy shadow across England, settling over the kingdom like a winter fog that refused to lift. The man who had always seemed carved from stone cold, reserved, eternally composed, was suddenly revealed to be nothing more than a husband who had lost the only person who had ever truly loved him without condition. When he read the letter Mary had left for him, the one she had written while death crept closer across her skin, William wept uncontrollably. Her words, gentle, wounded, honest, cut straight through the armor he had worn all his life. News of her passing spread slowly at first, in soft, stunned whispers, and then in great crashing waves of grief that rolled from London to the distant shires. Bells tolled. Churches opened their doors through the night. The streets filled with people who moved as if the world itself had dimmed. But no one grieved more than William. The moment Mary's breath faded, he collapsed beside her, so overcome by sorrow that attendants had to steady him as he tried to stand. Instead, they arranged one of the most magnificent funerals ever given to a Queen of England. The procession stretched through the city, a river of black-clad mourners, moving with slow, reverent steps. People waited for hours to view the coffin, many crying openly in the winter air. They came not out of obligation, but out of love for the woman who had steadied the nation while William fought abroad, for the Queen whose calm voice had guided England through storms. She wrote of the pain she had carried in silence, the betrayal she had endured with grace, the fear that he had allowed Elizabeth Villiers to harm not only their marriage, but his own soul. For William, the letter was both a farewell and a mirror, showing him the harm he had never intended, but had nevertheless inflicted. He broke when he finished reading it. Mary had requested a simple funeral, a quiet service without grandeur, but the court refused. Across the Channel, in France, Mary's father refused to mourn her. James II would not allow a memorial. To him, she remained the daughter who had betrayed him, the child who had taken his crown by standing beside her husband. Yet inside French churches, candles were quietly lit. Ordinary French citizens, many of whom had never met her, and some who still remembered her kindness from her time in Holland, prayed for her soul, whispering her name in soft shadows. In the weeks that followed her death, William changed. He dismissed Elizabeth Villiers at once, forcing her into exile with a coldness that shocked the court. He continued Mary's charitable works, supporting hospitals, churches, and the poor, because he believed she would have wanted it. And every day, without fail, he prayed. The man who had rarely prayed before now knelt in solitude, whispering words to a God he hoped still listened. But all of it came far too late. Mary's absence hollowed him. He never remarried. He spent the rest of his life looking older than his years, walking through Kensington with the weary gait of someone carrying an invisible weight. Those who had once thought him unfeeling now saw the truth. Mary had been the centre of his world, the anchor he had never realized he depended on until she was gone. Her legacy, though complex, was profound. She helped carve the foundation of England's constitutional monarchy, a system that balanced royal authority with parliamentary strength. Her calm leadership during William's long absences ensured that the kingdom survived both war and political upheaval. Her devotion to faith shaped moral reforms that influenced society far beyond her lifetime, and her dignity, quiet, unwavering, tender even in suffering, became the hallmark of her reign. Mary II had never been raised to be a queen. She had never sought a throne. She had never pursued power or glory or command. Yet by the time she left the world, she had shaped the future of England in ways deeper and gentler than battles or laws could measure. She died at 32 before the world had time to change because of her, before she had time to live for herself. But those who remembered her knew that she had ruled with a rare grace. The grace of a woman who bore burdens she never chose, yet carried them with faith, loyalty, and a softness that outlasted her own life. Mary II, quiet daughter, reluctant queen, gentle guardian of a turbulent kingdom, fell before her time, but left behind a legacy that continued to breathe long after her final breath faded on that cold December night. On the 28th day of December, in the year 1694, at only 32 years old, Mary II breathed her last. William was still holding her hand when she went, his grief so consuming that those present said they had never seen a heart break so visibly. She ordered that anyone in the palace who had never contracted smallpox be sent away immediately for safety. She requested that her private letters be burned, sorting through them with trembling hands, letting the flames swallow secrets she wished no one to read. She arranged her belongings, set matters in order, and wrote what would become her final will. And then she turned to the letter she had always feared she might someday write, a letter meant for William.